Welcome back to John Bachman Now. I'm Bianca De La Garza.
And I'm Tom Basili in for John Bachman. Labor unions that were deemed ineligible for the Paycheck Protection Program have received $36.7 million in fraudulent loans. That's according to the Washington Free Beacon.
And this program that launched during the beginning of the pandemic was supposed to, of course, provide relief for small businesses and charities. But according to Small Business Administration rules, only nonprofits registered as 501c charitable organizations were eligible for it.
But 226 labor unions that were ineligible to receive a loan got them. So the question is, how did it happen? Joining us now is Labor Policy Director of the Freedom Foundation, Max Nelsen. Welcome, Max.
My pleasure, Tom. Thanks for having me.
So, Max, $64,000 question. How did it happen?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about how it happened, but this is a complete system-wide breakdown here is the short version. Again, this is multiple hundreds of loans across unions around the country, $37 million. We saw groups like teachers unions that were advocating for these COVID lockdowns and simultaneously applying for and getting these loans that they were ineligible to receive. A lot of very shady practices here, to be sure. But basically, the way the program worked was someone who wanted to apply for and receive a Paycheck Protection Program loan would have to submit an application that was prepared by the Small Business Administration, which operated this program. The application would go to a private bank, private financial institution that was approved by the SBA to review these loans and actually made the decision about whether to approve or reject a loan. And then that information was then reported to the Small Business Administration, which was supposed to have controls in place to ensure that only eligible organizations were getting the funds. So from what we can tell, the breakdown here occurred probably because there was fraudulent information submitted on the applications and because the financial institutions weren't doing their due diligence and checking to make sure these groups were eligible, and of course they weren't. And then the Small Business Administration dropped the ball at the end of the line by not double checking and making sure that the money was only going to approved recipients.
I mean, so many flaws here, Max, and we want to ask you, it was $800 billion, and it was laden with fraud as well, as we've seen so many people get arrested for their scams. So what do you think this means moving ahead for the future of the Paycheck Protection Program?
Well, as I understand it, the PPP funds have pretty much all been dispersed now. I don't know that it's possible for groups to go out and apply for new money. But looking backwards, I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered still. This is not the first type of first instance where fraudulent activity has been uncovered through the PPP program. Now, it's the first time that labor unions have been exposed as receiving this money inappropriately. But I think there are tools available to the federal government to try to make this right for American taxpayers, at least to a certain extent. And we have submitted copies of our findings to the Small Business Administration's Inspector General, which has uncovered other ways in which the SBA's handling of the program was flawed. We've also submitted our findings to the U.S. Department of Justice, which has a National Center on Disaster Fraud, because there is a high likelihood that some, if not most or all of these loan applications were fraudulently submitted. So ideally, the federal government tries to fix its mistakes, recover some of this money, and if appropriate, pursue criminal investigations.
To Bianca's point, Max, when it comes to PPP fraud, this is really the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? Did we have any evidence that money may have gone to, for instance, political advocacy organizations that were not supposed to get it, or that it was used for political influence in some fashion? What else do we know here?
Well, just looking at the evidence that I'm familiar with here, these 226 loans to unions, these labor organizations themselves put a lot of the revenue that they usually collect from dues into explicit political activity. The teachers unions that we saw, we identified about a dozen teachers unions that received almost $7 million in PPP funds, tend to be very politically active. We identified about another dozen public sector, government unions of state workers and municipal employees around the country that received another $1.5 million. They tend to be very active politically. And probably the best example, though, is we found several organizations, AFL-CIO organizations. And the AFL-CIO is basically a trade association, an industry group for unions. And because they represent unions and not workers, these AFL-CIO affiliates tend to be very active politically. So we saw the Pennsylvania AFL-CIO, the Alaska AFL-CIO. A lot of this money, I think, that we exposed on our report going to these ineligible labor unions probably found its way into political activity.
Okay. All right. Thank you for exposing this. Max Nelsen, Labor Policy Director for the Freedom Foundation. Appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. That's going to do it for this first hour of John Bachman Now. Much more ahead. We've been focused on Ukraine, but while tensions mount there, what's happening with the Biden administration's push for a new Iran deal?
We'll speak to a guest about that and what we need to be watching. Also, our panel will be back, Tom. It's this week's meme team. Some really funny memes. John has filed his special report on the memes, so he is still here in spirit. Stick around. Another hour of John Bachman Now continues this Friday.